In 1891, the city of Chicago was handed an impossible task. They were told to build a city, a full, working, magnificent city with canals, palaces, electrical grids, monumental sculpture, and 200 separate buildings, on a swamp on the southern edge of Lake Michigan. They had 2 years. They had a budget that politicians kept slashing. They had winters that killed workers and mud that swallowed foundations. And on top of all of that, they had a war raging inside the very team designing it. And yet, on May 1st, 1893, 27 million Americans looked at what rose from that swamp, and they wept. Grown men and women, farmers who had mortgaged their homes just to make the trip. They stood at the gates of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, looked at the gleaming white domes and colonnades stretching half a mile in every direction, and they just wept. But what if the most beautiful thing America ever built was also a trap? What if one man used the most visited event in American history as a weapon to destroy the most original architectural movement this country had ever produced, and replace it with a copy of ancient Rome? That is exactly what happened, and the man who did it, the man who made that call, didn't do it out of malice. He did it because he genuinely believed he was right. He was a visionary, he was charismatic, he was arguably the most powerful man in American architecture at that moment, and his name was Daniel Burnham. This is the story of the 1893 World's Fair, but it's not the story you've heard before. It's not the story of the serial killer. It's not the story of the Ferris wheel. It's the story of the greatest architectural battle in American history, a battle fought between 2 men, 2 visions for what this country should look like, and a 6-month window that permanently changed the answer. 1 man won, 1 man lost. And whether you realize it or not, you live inside the consequences every single day. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what was being built. Because in the years leading up to 1893, Chicago was doing something genuinely revolutionary, something that had never been done before anywhere in the history of human construction. They were inventing the skyscraper, not just the physical form, not just the concept of a tall building, but a complete original architectural philosophy to go with it, a philosophy built entirely on American soil, by American minds for American cities. It was called the Chicago School, and its central prophet was a man named Louis Sullivan. Sullivan's core idea was breathtaking in its simplicity. A building should look like what it does. Not like a Greek temple, not like a Roman palace, not like anything Europe had already built and buried centuries ago. A Chicago office building should look like a Chicago office building, tall, proud, vertical, adorned with Sullivan's extraordinary organic ornamentation that seemed to grow from the structure like vines from stone. It was wild, it was new, it was distinctly, defiantly American. And it was working. By the late 1880s, Chicago was the most architecturally exciting city on the planet. European critics were making pilgrimages across the Atlantic just to look at the buildings going up on Wabash Avenue. The Chicago School was not a regional curiosity, it was the future. Sullivan, his partner Dankma Adler, and a rising generation of disciples, including a young apprentice named Frank Lloyd Wright, were pointing at where architecture was going. The whole world was starting to follow. Then came the fair, and everything changed, not gradually, not through debate or democratic process. It changed because of a single series of decisions made in a single room, by a single man who believed, sincerely, passionately believed, that he knew better. The question is, did he? When Chicago won the right to host the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, beating out New York, Washington, and St. Louis in a congressional vote, the city's architectural establishment assumed something obvious. They assumed the fair would showcase what Chicago actually did, what Chicago was actually good at, what Chicago had spent 20 years proving to the world. They were wrong. Daniel Burnham was named Director of Works for the fair. He was the right man for the job in almost every respect. Organized, relentless, visionary, completely fearless about the scale of the undertaking. He moved onto the construction site in a literal wooden shack he called the shanty and lived there for the duration of the build. His motto, still famous today, was, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." He was not a man who did things halfway. But here's where the story turns. Burnham needed architects, and instead of centering the Chicago School, the people who had built this city into a world architectural capital, he reached east. He brought in the patrician, European-educated architects of New York and Boston. McKim, Mead and White, Richard Morris Hunt, George B. Post, men who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, men steeped in Greek columns, Roman domes, and Renaissance symmetry. Men who looked at Sullivan's organic, American, forward-looking skyscrapers and saw something unrefined, something not quite respectable enough. The stylistic mandate was issued, and it was non-negotiable. The main buildings of the fair, the Grand Court of Honor, the centerpiece of the entire exposition, would be built in Beaux-Arts neoclassicism. soaring columns, pediments, Roman domes, uniform white facades. All the buildings would be painted the same brilliant white. That's where the name White City came from, and all of them would adhere to a cornice line of exactly 60 feet. It would look coherent. It would look grand. It would look, Burnham said, like civilization. Louis Sullivan was furious. He was given a building, the Transportation Building, but it was placed off to the side of the Court of Honor, away from the main sightlines, as if it were an embarrassing relative kept out of the family portrait. And Sullivan did what Sullivan always did. He made it extraordinary anyway. He covered it in brilliant reds, blues, greens, and gold. He built what became known as the Golden Door, a cascading arch of color so breathtaking that Paris awarded it an international medal. The only building at the entire fair to receive that honor. The only building at the fair that was actually doing something new. Now let me walk you through the buildings themselves, because the architecture of the White City is not just a visual story, it's an argument. Every column, every dome, every cornice line was a vote cast in the debate between Burnham and Sullivan, and the vote count was not close. The administration building was Burnham's crown jewel, a colossal domed structure anchoring the western end of the Grand Basin. Its massive Corinthian columns, its gilded dome, its overwhelming sense of imperial permanence, and here's the thing people forget, it was built entirely from something called staff. A cheap mixture of plaster and jute fiber painted white. It was magnificent. It was also fake marble over a wooden frame. When the fair closed, it burned. But before it burned, 27 million Americans had looked at it and thought, this is what authority looks like. This is what a government building should look like. And they took that idea home. Of all the White City's 200 buildings, only one survives today. The Palace of Fine Arts, now Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, is your best chance to stand inside the 1893 fair. In 1933, its original staff facade was replaced with concrete to preserve it permanently. Walk up its steps, look at those Ionic columns, that classical pediment, that absolute confidence in the language of ancient Greece, and understand that this is what Burnham decided America's cultural institutions should look like. And he was right in a way, because they still do. And then there was Sullivan's Transportation Building, a long, low structure alive with color and organic pattern, its great arched entrance layered in geometric decoration that seemed to breathe. It won a gold medal from Paris. It was segregated from the main Court of Honor. After the fair, it was demolished. Sullivan's career never recovered from the shadow the White City cast over American taste. Sullivan himself described what Burnham had built in language so vivid it still stings 100 years later. He called the neoclassicism of the White City, and I'm quoting him directly now, the virus of the World's Fair. That led to a violent outbreak of the classic and the Renaissance, the bogus antique. And then he wrote this, architecture died in the land of the free and the home of the brave. He was being dramatic, but only slightly. Here is what 27 million visitors means in 1893. The United States had a population of 63 million people. Nearly half the country, accounting for children and those who physically couldn't travel, went to this fair. They came from farms in Iowa and textile mills in Georgia and cattle ranches in Wyoming. Many of them had never seen a city. Many of them had never seen a building taller than a grain silo. And they arrived in Chicago and walked into a world of white marble columns and gilded domes that looked like something out of a dream. Then they went home and they looked at their town hall, they looked at their bank, they looked at their library, their post office, their train station, and they thought, this is wrong, this is small, this is shabby, and they started demanding something different. They wanted columns, they wanted domes, they wanted the White City. This movement had a name, the City Beautiful. It swept through American urban planning like a fire through dry timber. Washington, D.C., already classical in its bones, was remade even more grandly. Cleveland, Detroit, San Francisco, Denver, city after city hired architects who had drunk from the Beaux-Arts well. Banks hired them, libraries hired them. Every courthouse in every county in every state suddenly needed columns. The White City had lasted 6 months. Its influence lasted 6 decades. Triangular pediments and classical columns spread across the entire country, on houses, churches, schools, train stations, office buildings, state capitals, and ultimately the United States Supreme Court building itself, completed in 1935. Every single one of those buildings is a direct descendant of the temporary fake plaster city that burned in Chicago in 1894. Every single one of them is Burnham's vision, replicated 1,000 times across a continent. Now here's where this story becomes genuinely complicated, because Burnham wasn't wrong that the fair was magnificent. He wasn't wrong that it moved people. The White City was, by almost any measure, the most emotionally powerful architectural achievement in American history. Katharine Lee Bates visited the fair in July 1893 and was so overwhelmed that she wrote a poem. That poem became a song. That song was America the Beautiful. The line about alabaster cities gleaming, she was talking about the White City. That's what she was looking at. So was it a crime that Burnham chose beauty over originality? Was it wrong to give people something transcendent, even if that something was borrowed? That's the argument that has been raging among architects and critics for 130 years. And it doesn't have a clean answer. What it has is a victim. And that victim was Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan spent the rest of his life watching his prophecy come true. After the fair, the American appetite for classical construction had been whetted. That's the exact phrase contemporary observers used. Whetted, and it devoured everything. Sullivan's clients dried up. His radical, living, organic architecture was suddenly unfashionable in a country that wanted columns and domes. He died in 1924 in a cheap Chicago rooming house, nearly broke, completing his last book by hand, a book in which he described what the fair had done to American architecture as, and these are his exact words, the virus of the White City. He was exaggerating, but only slightly. Sullivan had one student who survived the flood, a young man who had worked in his office in the early 1890s, and who carried Sullivan's fire forward with such ferocity that he eventually became the most famous American architect who ever lived. His name was Frank Lloyd Wright, and Wright spent his entire 70-year career doing exactly what Sullivan had argued for at the fair, building something new, something American. Something that didn't look like Athens or Rome or Paris. When Wright designed Fallingwater in 1935, or the Guggenheim in 1943, he was completing the project that Sullivan had started, the project the White City had tried to bury. Meanwhile, the White City that had killed Sullivan's career didn't even survive long enough to see what it had caused. Fire broke out in the fairgrounds in the months after the Exposition closed. The plaster palaces, built from staff, remember, from jute and plaster, never meant to last, burned spectacular and fast. The administration building, the manufacturers hall, which had been the largest building in the world during the fair, the machinery hall, all gone. The most beautiful fake city ever built. 6 months of existence, 60 years of consequence. Here is the part of this story that should stop you cold, because we are not finished with the White City. We never were. In the 1930s, a young man named Walt Disney spent time studying the legacy of the 1893 fair. When he designed EPCOT, his experimental prototype community of tomorrow, historians have noted that he was essentially reimagining Burnham's dream, a planned, beautiful, organized showcase of civilization. With cultural pavilions for nations, grand promenades, and the sense that the built environment could elevate the human spirit. The White City's DNA is in Disney World. It is in Las Vegas. It is in every planned utopian urban development that dreams of a city so beautiful it makes people better. Look at your city, really look at it. Find the oldest bank building downtown, the one with the columns. Find the public library from the early 1900s, the one with the pediment and the stone steps. Find the post office, the courthouse, the train station if one still stands. You are looking at the White City. You are looking at 27 million people who went to a fair in Chicago and came back changed. You are looking at Daniel Burnham's vision, his imposition, depending on your perspective, of what America should look like. Now here's the question I keep coming back to. Sullivan was right that the fair set back modern American architecture. He was absolutely right about that. The evidence is everywhere. The consensus of architectural historians is almost unanimous. The Chicago School's forward momentum was broken. Something new and genuinely American was interrupted. That's just true. But here's what else is true. Those 27 million Americans who wept at the gates, they weren't wrong to weep. What Burnham built was genuinely, staggeringly beautiful. The White City was a vision of what a city could be if beauty were treated as a moral imperative rather than an afterthought. The fact that it was borrowed beauty, Greek columns translated into plaster on a Chicago swamp, doesn't make what people felt standing in front of it less real. Burnham understood something Sullivan's ideology struggled to accommodate. People need to be moved before they can be convinced. He moved them. The question is whether the price was worth it. Louis Sullivan said it best himself, in one of his more lucid moments near the end of his life. He called what Burnham did a virus, but he also called the buildings magnificent. He couldn't help it. Even the man who believed most passionately that the White City was wrong couldn't look at it without being undone. That contradiction, the idea that something can be both wrong and beautiful, both destructive and transcendent, is what makes the 1893 World's Fair the most interesting event in American architectural history. Not the serial killer, not the Ferris wheel. This, the beautiful catastrophe, the dream that cost us the future. I want to leave you with one final thing. In 1901, 8 years after the fair, Daniel Burnham went back to work. He was appointed to redesign Washington, D.C. He brought the same Beaux-Arts vision, the same classical mandate, and he applied it to the capital of the most powerful nation on earth. The National Mall as you know it today, that long sweep of monuments and museums, that sense of Roman permanence at the heart of American democracy, that is Burnham's vision, extended outward from the 6-month fake city he built on a Chicago swamp. He won. He completely, utterly, permanently won. Was Daniel Burnham a visionary who gave America beauty when it needed it most? Or was he the man who looked at the most exciting architectural movement his country had ever produced and deliberately strangled it? I genuinely don't know. I've been thinking about it for years. Tell me what you think in the comments. The White City burned, but it never really went away. It's in the columns on your courthouse. It's in the dome on your state capitol. It's in America the beautiful. It's in the way Americans even now picture power and beauty not as something new and native and growing, but as something ancient, borrowed, gleaming white. The fair lasted 6 months. The dream lasted forever. Whether that's a triumph or a tragedy, maybe it's both, is the question that architecture still hasn't answered. Subscribers get an early look. I release new episodes 24 hours early to subscribers. Subscribe and comment, if you want a deeper walkthrough. I'll prioritize the most requested.